3 different winners over the past 4 Grand Prix and a Mercedes on pole position and back in the mix at last. I think it's fair to say no one expected that at the start of F1 2024. So is F1 now an open fight at the front? What can we expect from the next race?
Certainly an open fight in terms of who we can expect to be in the mix on any given weekend. Red Bull and Max Verstappen still runaway favourites for the championship, I would say. But obviously this question of the pack closing, competitiveness is all a relative game, and Red Bull has struggled a bit more to exert its dominance in the same way. But it's been a strange set of races. Imola they did win. Miami before that they should have won but didn't. Monaco should have been second or third. Obviously, Verstappen made a mistake in Q3, so that went wrong. And then they did win last time out in Canada. So 50% win rate still from Red Bull. Should have been 75%, and they struggled on the great outlier that was Monaco. So a strange set of races. Red Bull certainly under more pressure, but we're about to go to a run of much more conventional circuits where I think the picture will be a little bit more stable, shall we say.
And Barcelona as the next race is the sort of ultimate embodiment of that. It's the classic car prover. It's a track that the teams know so well historically, but it's just the layout of it, and especially now we've got rid of that horrible final chicane and we're back on the classic layout. It lets a car that's strong aerodynamically flex its muscles. So it's always seen as whether a team has something to prove or is just starting to kind of show itself a little bit. It's a great acid test of actually what the situation is in reality. And I think that's what we'll see with Red Bull. I think they've been, as Ed was explaining, battling different circumstances. They've gone through quite a tough run, very possibly the toughest run of the season in terms of the types of circuits and then also the circumstances around the races. It would be difficult to imagine sort of a set of 3 or 4 events that would test Red Bull the way the most recent one has. But then we go to a circuit that should bring it right back to its absolute very best. So I think we're going to see in reality whether or not the car is still as strong as it's been, even since it obviously had its big upgrade at Imola, or whether Mercedes' theory is correct and that car has accidentally been downgraded.
Well, yeah, this was James Allison, the Mercedes technical director, joked in Canada that the upgrade for Red Bull looks like a downgrade. I say joked. It was said with a little bit of mischievousness, shall we say.
He wanted it to be true.
And he loves a wind-up too, doesn't he? He loves a wind-up at the moment.
Exactly, yeah. But I think he'll have been emboldened as well by the fact he knew that the Mercedes progress was going to be proved to be real that weekend. So ultimately, Red Bull, their car has improved with recent upgrades, but it's all relative, isn't it? If you improve at a slower rate than others, then you do look like you get worse. It's all relative. And I think Red Bull certainly hasn't had the same development rate as some of its rivals over the past few races. There'll be upgrades again in Spain, but this is a good test of where the real lay of the land is. Barcelona is a great measure of a car. Big aero test, nice wide range of corner speeds. So this is a great track to really judge where everyone's at.
Yeah, and if Barcelona is going to tell us how much ground Red Bull has lost, it should also tell us how much ground its rivals have made up. McLaren probably have had the most impressive development rate of any team over the past 12 months, could have conceivably won 3 of the past 4 Grand Prix, has outscored everybody in that time too. So can we consider them to be a genuine threat to Red Bull at every race now?
I think they're at a point now where they can consistently score podiums. Whether or not they can threaten Red Bull at every race remains to be seen. And you're right, Barcelona is a good test. This is the kind of circuit that McLaren's prodigious development last year with high-speed performance would really excel at. But actually, others have made good steps in that area. So it will be interesting. If you look at from the point where that McLaren upgrade came in, which was for the Miami weekend, the before and since comparison is pretty stark. They've basically halved their pace deficit on average in effectively qualifying. It's gone from around 0.4 of a second to 0.2 of a second. That's not strictly to Red Bull, because Red Bull's not always been the quickest since then. For example, Charles Leclerc and Ferrari in Monaco. But you mentioned it, Ben. They've scored more points than anybody in the last few races. They've been on the podium at every race since that upgrade was introduced. They could have won a third of the season's races by now if circumstances had gone differently. So they've definitely gained. They've gone from that slightly adrift of the top couple of teams in the early part of the season to absolutely being in the mix at the front, consistent podium challengers week in, week out. They're probably best of the rest at the moment, just purely across a wide range of circuits. Maybe every now and again they'll miss that absolute bit of peak performance, but they're right in there, and they just look really well placed to try and profit if Red Bull does slip up.
And those upgrades have yielded a little bit more performance than anticipated. Not so much in terms of the pure measurables of it, but in terms of the lap time gain. Now, initially, Andrea Stella, the team principal, put that down to the various intangibles, driver confidence, that kind of thing. But there does seem to be some kind of technical, probably aero effect going on here, that over the past few races, their understanding of that has evolved. So I think McLaren also think they've almost tripped over discovering something with this as well. They always expected a gain from it, but it's been a bigger all-round gain. It's helped them in low speed, helped them in higher speed too. But the car's becoming a little bit more of an all-rounder. Still weaker on the slower corners, but it's getting there. That's the really important thing for them. So it can be a threat at more circuits, and we're seeing that reflected in the consistency of late.
And you might be picking up from this that both Ed and I are kind of caveating where McLaren's at in terms of that ultimate performance, and that's because even McLaren itself doesn't believe it's a Red Bull beater yet. I mentioned it's halved its deficit to the front, but you halve a deficit, that means you still have a deficit. So that's where McLaren's at. On their day of days, they might actually be able to beat Red Bull and any other car over qualifying in one lap. They might be able to win the race and be in a strong position. But across all conditions, all circuit types, all kinds of circumstances that challenge you over a race weekend, McLaren admits it still has a little bit to do. So as we've said, right in the mix, outright absolute Red Bull beater on pure performance, not quite yet. So again, but if they can get close in Barcelona, I think that will say an awful lot about the trajectory that team's on.
But where does Ferrari stand in all of this? You know, the start of the season, they look like clearly being the second best team. They've won a couple of races. After Monaco, they were even being talked up as a potential title threat. And then we go to Canada and they have the absolute horror show of that race. Are they a team we still need to be taking seriously? Should we be concerned after what we saw in Canada?
I think you can pretty much shrug off Canada. Pretty much everything that could go wrong did go wrong there. They got the tyre pressures wrong in qualifying. I think the resurfaced track slightly caught them out, couldn't get the tyres in, and just a horrible weekend. No points, just a disaster. But that's not Ferrari's level, nor is Ferrari's level what we saw in Monaco. They were the dominant force in Monaco, but that's a great outlier track, so it worked really well for them. The reality is Ferrari is still strong. They're still a pretty good all-round car, but you go to a track like Barcelona, you will expect them to be about where they were earlier in the season, a few tenths off, maybe fractionally closer come race pace, but you'd still expect them to be a bit behind Red Bull, at least without some upgrades shuffling the order in that regard. So Ferrari still making good progress, but Fred Vasseur, the team principal, won't let them get carried away, will he, in terms of overreacting to Monaco or overreacting to Canada.
Yeah, Vasseur's, I think, probably the best possible team principal Ferrari could have during this moment that they're in. He kind of steadied the ship last year, and it's been a relatively smooth start to 24, and now they've had the first big setback and probably the first real test of his leadership so far. But he is so middle of the road, as Ed was sort of explaining there. He cares about neither triumph nor disaster, and he's just kind of like, okay, well, even if we're doing well, we need to improve, and if we're doing really badly, it's probably not as bad as it looks, so we just need to focus on where we can improve. So much like every team we've talked about so far, I think Barcelona is a really big test for Ferrari, not so much in how they respond to Canada, but you think back, we talk about, you know, Mercedes joking that the Red Bulls had a downgrade. The Ferrari had that big upgrade at Imola and slightly underwhelmed over the rest of the weekend, purely based on the hype that was over that upgrade and development into the weekend. Still a good enough weekend, but not good enough against Red Bull and McLaren. Then they go to Monaco, which is an outlier. Charles Leclerc's on it all weekend, so they dominate. Then they go to Canada, where they're expected to do well and absolutely stink the place up. So now we're going to a conventional circuit that's going to test it. It's really interesting to see where Ferrari shakes out in this. It's one of the reasons why this weekend has a little bit of a kind of most important weekend of the season so far about it, because not for a specific team, but for F1 2024 as a whole, because we have a new pecking order to try to understand.
Well, for Mercedes, it probably is the most important weekend of the season, though. I mean, you mentioned them in your previous answer, Scott. You know, they suddenly in Canada, although we've seen kind of incremental progress, they haven't really looked like being anything other than the fourth best team and maybe a bit distant from the front. And then suddenly they're on pole position, leading a race, slightly different circumstances and execution. They could have conceivably won it. So do we have to start taking Mercedes seriously again in terms of the fight at the front?
Yeah, very much so. The important thing is there's reasons for why they've made these steps. The new front wing, much has been said about that in terms of having the more loaded front wing. They are not struggling so much with creating instability at the rear by having the front wing being just too powerful because it works in ground effects. And if you just got too
They
much load,
ditched the old one basically, haven't they, and gone to a
exactly,
more
yeah,
conventional one.
exactly, yeah. You run the risk of sort of pinning the front end, and then by definition that means the balance at the rear. It's a problem, but it's not just that. They've been working with the floor profile, the sort of floor ceiling shape. That's an important thing for Red Bull, where they benefited from. So they're gaining and they're understanding. There's a little bit of apparent flexi wing trickiness in there, not in a negative way. Everyone at the front is doing that. There's got to be some flexibility. Can't be completely rigid no matter what the rules say. So that's fine. That's just what they're doing, even if some rivals may be suspicious about it. There's always that in Formula One, competitive paranoia. But they've made real gains. You could say they should have won in Canada, quite frankly, on pole, on merit. The way the race panned out wasn't perfect for them. And I think we will see Mercedes in pretty good shape.
The problem with them is that why you have to you take that Canada performance with a pinch of salt is because they've had so many false dawns in the past, and you can look at it as a single event in isolation. If you ignore context and you just look at that one weekend, you go, yeah, but they didn't win for starters. And also, like, we've seen this before, where suddenly the stars align and they have a mega qualifying result and they're up there on the podium, blah blah blah. But all of that stuff Ed outlined is why this is so significant, because there just seems to be something tangible behind it. There actually does seem to be a foundation for all of this. That progress has been quite boring and chipping away at. In a sense, no big, sexy, massive upgrade like McLaren had last season, for example. But people misremember that as well, because it wasn't like McLaren came out of nowhere with one upgrade in Austria. They actually had a pretty big upgrade in Baku that sort of set the tone for where they would go. So it took 2 goes at it, really. And that's kind of what you've seen with Mercedes. Lay that foundation, layer on a bit of performance, and just get there basically by just doing good, solid, sort of old-fashioned development work rather than trying to reinvent the floor or reinvent the wing. So I think it's interesting, but I would say that just because they had that, and just in Montreal, and just because they had good reason for it, that doesn't mean that they'll go to Barcelona and be fighting for pole, and may not even be on the podium, but that wouldn't necessarily be a disaster.
Yeah, there's reasons to be sceptical about Mercedes simply because of what we've seen over the past few years. But this is different. There's a logic underpinning it. It's not just unlocking magical performance in the car. It's changes that have a tangible effect. And yeah, you're absolutely right in terms of what to expect. I'd be staggered if Mercedes are setting the pace at Barcelona. They don't need to be. But if they can be a proper, clear step forward in there bothering Ferrari and McLaren, assuming they're behind Red Bull, then that's a big positive step, because they'd established themselves as 4th best prior to Monaco. I guess Monaco, they were pretty strong as well. But if they can sustain this at regular circuits, that confirms the progress, and that's something to build from. And then it's just about the long, drawn-out battle of development. Can they put performance on the car quicker than the opposition?
Yeah, the key thing there is understanding, isn't it? So many times they've had these false dawns, a foundation that really they haven't been able to build on, and now it finally looks like they've got a proper foundation that they can build on. And then it's a case of, well, how quickly can you build on it, and can you build quicker than the teams around you? But one team, maybe there are still massive question marks in that regard, at Aston Martin. 12 months ago, regular podium finisher, nearest threat to Red Bull, but they're not even in this conversation anymore. So what the hell is going on there?
Yeah, Aston Martin really struggling. They kind of reasserted themselves a little bit in Canada, but they'd sort of slipped to 5th best, maybe even 6th best behind RB prior to that. And I think Barcelona is going to be tough for them without some improvements on the car. Barcelona's been quite an important circuit for them the past few years. In 2022, they introduced a pretty major concept change, having realised they got things initially wrong, kind of in the Mercedes direction originally, but that laid the foundations for the 23 car. And then we got to Barcelona last year, and it was the first sign of struggle. And now we get to Barcelona this year, and I suspect what we're going to see is confirmation that they're not quite making the progress they should be. We talked about Mercedes demonstrating understanding. What they say in public, what they're saying privately, what we're seeing on track, all seems to add up into a consistent picture. With Aston Martin, not so much. They're just not that convincing in what they're saying. And that's fine. You can be unconvincing in what you're saying if you're performing. They're not doing either, and that's a concern.
Yeah, it's a team that is borderline in decline, but more worryingly, I think, is the fact that it's in stagnation. It's just been in this permanent position now since the middle of last year, where it's sort of 5th or 6th fastest, depending on the circumstances. And The most concerning element of it is that when they try to bring in season upgrades, it just either makes the car trickier to drive, or it just doesn't work at all. It does seem to be the team that is arguably the most sensitive to the way that these cars work and how tricky it is to add that downforce and performance without massively negatively changing the car characteristics. And they talk about trying to give the drivers confidence and having that, making it easier to drive, because then there is performance there that they can get out of it. But it's just a bit, sometimes it just looks a bit weird, and it looks like it saps the confidence from the driver. And all of this means is that this is a team that 12 months ago, when it was having those great early season results, you're looking at that kind of trajectory and the plan that they laid out back in whatever it was, 2021 for Aston Martin. And you think, yeah, why can't this team win races and start winning regularly by 25, which was the stated objective? They look so far from doing that in 25. So yeah, I don't think this is an important weekend for that team insofar of proving anything, but it's what it does between now and the end of the year. It has to pull some kind of better trajectory out of the bag. Otherwise, I think it's a team that is it's failing against its original plan, and it's only going to come under more pressure.
The positive for them is they're still not too far behind, so if they can make a bit of a breakthrough, they can push back into that pack ahead. But that also tells you what we've got here is convergence ultimately. Red Bull still seems to have the best all-round package, but there's 3 teams pretty close behind, and it wouldn't take too much for Aston Martin and RB to get into that group, to be quite honest. So we're at a point where if you're Red Bull, there's 3 teams that are close, and they've got their own strengths and weaknesses. So on any given weekend, if you're not executing at your best, one of those is probably going to be at least bothering you, if not ahead. And that's what makes the rest of the season so interesting. Even if Barcelona is a Red Bull victory, and if I had to put money on it right now, I'd say it would be, the others are close, and it's going to set the course for a pretty interesting rest of the season, even I think on these more conventional tracks.